here at the Schar School. My job today is to moderate this first panel of the conference. And this panel covers three major themes in international relations: demography and urbanization, trade and economics, the environment and climate change. When I was in the graduate school, these issues were considered to be underlying forces for international relations, but maybe removed from immediate security concern. That has all changed. As a case in point, the current White House considers two of these three issues to have immediate and serious national security implications. They have invoked national security to justify immigration policy and trade policy. By contrast, the White House seems to consider the climate change to be a hoax. And my view is different. I think it's a serious issue. I was in Seoul, Korea this summer for 3 weeks in late July and early August. There was a record-breaking heat wave and was just unrelenting. I took a trip to the DMZ, and I couldn't help wondering which was more threatening, the heat or the North Koreans. So how do we conceptualize demography, trade, and the environment? Fortunately, we have three distinguished panelists to talk about all this. My colleague, Professor Jack Goldstone, will analyze demography and a few related issues. He's really a leading authority on this issue. He was in Hong Kong recently for 2 years, heading a foreign public policy institute. He wanted to observe all these changes in Asia up close and personal. Fortunately for us, he returned to the Schar School. Dr. Ellen Frost will discuss the trade disputes and the economy. She is currently a senior fellow at the East-West Center. When it comes to trade relations with East Asia, U.S. trade relations with East Asia, no one is more qualified than Dr. Frost. I remember when I was in the graduate school, and I heard Dr. Frost talking about U.S.-Japan trade disputes. And she also held several important positions in the U.S. government. Sherry Goodman of the Woodrow Wilson Center will take on the environment topic. And Sherry Goodman received a JD from Harvard Law School. And she's really a pioneer in thinking about the relationship between security and the environment. I think she innovated with the notion of a threat multiplier. And she also had several important positions in the U.S. government, including the first deputy undersecretary of defense. You have the three speakers' bios in front of you, so I'm not going to waste any time talking about their many accomplishments in great detail. I assume that you're here to hear from them directly rather than from me talking about them. And without further ado, I will now turn to our panelists. We will follow the order in the program. The panelists will each have about 15 minutes, and I will probably put up a sign, 2 minutes left, 0 minute. Now, Professor Goldstone.
Well, thank you very much for coming this morning. As with Professor Friedberg, I only have limited time, and so rather than try and address the human element across all of Asia, I will focus on China. I think it's a reasonable focus because China is both the most dynamic and the most perplexing of Asian countries now in terms of what is happening with the human element. I'd be happy to talk about trends in Japan, Korea, Australia, elsewhere in the Pacific during question and answer. But let's start with the story of China because it is, as Professor Friedberg said, looming as a large, growing power and is perceived by many as a growing threat to the existing world order. I title this China as the most and least modern great power because the story of China is not one where I could tell you, is China powerful, rising, and great, or as others have said, is it teetering on the edge of some economic or political catastrophe as its system runs into its own complexities and paradoxes? I think the answer at the moment is both. China is rising, increasing in power in many dimensions, but at the same time is also facing a large number of negative trends, and how these will turn out is something that we cannot predict, and we will have to simply perceive. Now, China is a paradox. In many respects, it's quite rich. Throughout its history, it's been the most innovative and advanced society in the world. China created gunpowder, the compass, paper, printing, canals, porcelain, cast iron. A long list of innovations crucial to all civilizations began in China. China even sailed to India and Africa centuries before Europe. And indeed, as early as 1000 AD, the richest areas of China had reached levels of income per head similar to those that Europe attained only centuries later. In the Renaissance Italy, Golden Age Holland, or England on the precipice of industrialization. But in the last 2 centuries, China has plumbed the depths of poverty. From about the mid-18th century, China underwent a rapid economic and political decline, partly because of internal rebellions that normally accompany the decline of a dynasty after 2 or 3 centuries, but magnified by the impact of foreign imperialism in the form of the Opium Wars. The Confucian legalist state, kind of the bureaucratic template for governing China that had been in place for centuries, started to collapse, a shortage of officials, a shortage of revenue. This led to civil wars and imperial incursions, Japanese invasion, the war between the nationalists and the communists, and in the 70s, the Great Cultural Revolution. These 2 centuries of rebellion, war, invasion, disorder, government decay impoverished China. By 1980, China's total GDP was only 1/3 that of France. This is not that long ago, right? Less than 40 years ago, the entire Chinese economy was less than 1/3 that of France, 1/5 that of Germany or Japan. Its GDP per capita in 1980 was roughly the same as an African developing country, about $300 per year in current US dollars. Astonishingly poor for a country that had led the world in technology and economy. But in the last 40 years, there has been a truly amazing rebound. China in this period has produced greater gains in economic output than any society in history. All Chinese are justifiably proud of this accomplishment. China's GDP has surpassed all other countries except the United States to become the 2nd largest economy in the world. Some China advocates point to purchasing power parity estimates that suggest the Chinese economy is already larger than that of the US in terms of the aggregate domestic purchasing power of China's population. GDP per capita has skyrocketed from $300 in current US dollars in 1980 to almost $9,000 in current US dollars. And in the coastal cities in Shanghai and Guangzhou, that is over $20,000 US dollars per year per capita income. So in 38 years, China basically undid 200 years of relative decline and is now seeking to recover its traditional role as the world's leading economic power. And this is particularly meaningful because China's a demographic giant. It has been the largest country in the world in population. Let's see if I have a pointer here. Not getting the... Well, the red line is the labor force in China. As you can see, over the last 60 years, China has enjoyed some of the strongest growth in labor force and become by far the largest labor force in the world. Only India has paralleled it in the last 50 years. All the other advanced countries in the region and the world have started to flatten out their labor force growth as fertility has declined. Yet that is not China's future, which looks very different from the past. The red line again is China, And this projection over the next 40 years is that China's labor force will decline. Similar to that of Europe, China is facing the problem of very low fertility, partly because of the one-child policy, but even as the one-child policy is now discarded, the Chinese people have developed a strong preference, like other Asian countries, for having fewer children and investing more in each child in what has become a very competitive educational and job market. And so as fertility has fallen, China's labor force looks to decline, and quite considerably. That is, from a labor force of about 950 million in 2010, they will be down to about 750 million by 2050. So China looks to lose a large portion of its labor force, particularly this is felt at the young military and job entry age. India, by contrast, will continue to grow and will soon surpass China as having the largest labor force in the world. Europe will be declining, US slightly growing, Brazil and Russia mostly flat, Russia slightly declining. Other big change in China. It's an urban giant. In 1950, China was still overwhelmingly rural. Barely 1 in 10 Chinese lived in cities. This has suddenly changed, like much else in China. Now 45% of the much larger Chinese population lives in cities. And China has now 25 of the world's 100 largest cities. From being a peasant nation that was defined by peasant lifestyles, China is increasingly becoming a country defined by its large cities. China has 15 cities now with more than 10 million inhabitants. And as an industrializing urban society, China's consumption of everything that goes into cities and industries has skyrocketed as well. China leads the world in consumption of coal, is second in oil, and leads in the production of greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, and in fact has twice the output of carbon dioxide as the US. And yet, here again with the paradoxes, China is also the world's largest and fastest growing provider of solar electricity. And through subsidies and generous support, China has become the world's leading manufacturer of solar electric panels, and they're in wide use. China's also been investing heavily in wind energy. So even though China is the dirtiest large economy in the world, it's also working hard to become cleaner. China is also, and this is true of all of the other advanced economies in Asia, China is aging fast. On the far left, you see the age pyramid in China from 2010. The age pyramid, each bar is the size of an age cohort, from those just born at the bottom to those in their 80s and 90s at the top. So what you see there is a large bulge in the middle, and then kind of a secondary bulge about 1/3 of the way up. What this basically is saying, these age groups are the prime labor force years for China. So China's been enjoying, up until 2010, a boom in the growth of the prime labor age cohorts. And that has, of course, helped China. As those people have moved into cities, they created a huge burst in increased productivity and output that helped drive China's economic growth. But the last 40 years have seen a sharp decline in the size of cohorts. And so if we project out to 2040, this group is aging, and the number of young people is much smaller. That kind of upside-down or tree-shaped age pyramid is increasingly characteristic of Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, even Australia. Even India, although it's still growing, is seeing a decline in its fertility, coming down to about 2.5 children per family from the previous heights of 4 to 5. This means the proportion of the elderly population in China is going to rise very sharply. There are 3 lines here. This graph to the right is the proportion of China's population age 60 and above as a fraction of the total population. So the red line, which is the low fertility projection of the United Nations, has China reaching about 40% 60 and older by 2050, and toward the end of the century, perhaps 50% of the population being age 60 and over. You might say, well, that's the low fertility projection. What about the green line and even the blue line? Those are lines assuming China is able to boost fertility, have many more children born. That lowers the percentage of elderly in the population. And indeed, China is actively trying to encourage Chinese mothers to have more children. The problem is most of the housing stock was built for one-child families. It's hard to find apartments that have 2 or 3 bedrooms. That discourages large families. The academic system is increasingly competitive. So again, the cost of tutoring, as in all other Asian countries, is concentrating effort on training small number of children for the competitive environment. So we see no sign that even as China scraps the official one-child policy and adds incentives, we see no sign of birth rates responding in any real way. So the low fertility line, or at best the medium fertility line, is probably China's future, which means they will have an unprecedentedly huge portion of the population 60 and over. Now, what we've seen in Japan and Korea is that it's possible to keep people employed. People who retire, they take additional jobs, they keep contributing. But in China, they are aging before, as it's often said, China will become old before it becomes rich. So China is going to have an aging population at an income level and a health level where it's not clear that it will be easy to keep people productive. So China is kind of facing this window between now and maybe 2030, 2040, when it still has large numbers of prime working age people in the population. After 2040, China's economic and demographic situation will start to get difficult. And so if China is going to raise its profile in the global stage, its opportunity is now. And this is, I think, what Professor Friedberg was saying. As part of its transformation, China has become an educational superpower. China has over 600,000 students studying abroad in any given year. 30 years ago, China graduated only 800,000 university students domestically. But by 2017, that number had risen to 8 million university graduates every year. You can see the curve on the right. The light blue line, that's U.S. annual enrollment in universities. That dark blue line that jumps like crazy after 1997, that's the number of university students enrolled in China. And China, including Hong Kong, has been ramping up the quality, investing a huge amount in improving faculty and faculty resources. And now China and Hong Kong together have 4 universities in the top 50 according to the Times Higher Education rankings. 2 in Hong Kong, but also Peking and Tsinghua universities. Nonetheless, despite this huge improvement in numbers and quality of universities and university students, China remains weak in invention and breakthroughs. It has the most patents in the world, but most of those patents are incremental changes in existing processes, not breakthroughs. Companies tend to advance not by creating totally new products or new processes, but by adopting Western innovations and figuring out ways to copy or produce those at lower cost. As Professor Friedberg mentioned, the internet within China is sealed and intensively monitored. Indeed, I was in China in June speaking at a university. We had a meeting with many graduate students in attendance, and we had as a guest speaker a spokesperson from the foreign ministry. And I pointed out that as China interacts with the world, it's not really helpful to limit access online to sources like the New York Times, where people have a chance to get valuable information. And the spokesman from the foreign ministry said, well, yes, but a lot of Chinese are impressionable, and need to be shielded from sophisticated sources, I'm sure that at a university like this, grad students have access to the New York Times and other information they need, at which all the graduate students in the back of the room started shaking their heads. No, we can't get in either. And indeed, their access is both ways. It's not only are you limited in what you can receive on the internet, but whatever you post on the internet, whether in social media or email, is monitored, and you can, as we've heard in many cases, get in trouble for adopting positions on the internet that are difficult. By and large, you can say what you want on the internet as long as you stay away from certain taboo subjects, like Tibet, Hong Kong independence, and you're okay if you're not part of an organized group. China's leadership figures independent dissidents can be overwhelmed simply by people putting out opposite stories on the internet and kind of drowning novel ideas with conventional conformist notions. What China's leadership gets worried about is organizations, any groups that have leadership and structure, even religious organizations. So the Christian churches in China are under assault because they represent a potential organization that could counter the Communist Party. Now, in the universities as well, ideological control is growing. Xi Jinping recently declared, to run our higher education system well, we must adhere to the leadership of the party, firmly grasp the leadership of the party over the work of colleges and universities, and enable colleges and universities to become a strong front to adhere to the leadership of the party. Now, in the natural sciences, engineering, this may not be that much of a problem, but in the social sciences, China is really moving backwards. In fact, Chinese universities have recently established 24 new research centers devoted to the study of Xi Jinping thought. And in the most recent round of applications for research grants from the Chinese government, most of the winning grant proposals had some, as in the social sciences, were to study some aspect of Xi Jinping thought and socialism with Chinese characteristics. So the paradoxes are piling up. China is changing so fast that no one, not even the Chinese, can fully grasp where they have come from and where they are going. Remember, they've gone in one generation, essentially, 40 years, from an income per capita of $300 per person, dirt poor, peasant country, to a modern, urbanized, industrial nation with incomes of roughly Portugal. So they've basically gone from Africa to Portugal in one generation. What this means is that hundreds of millions of Chinese have new experiences, new resources, new opportunities to travel abroad, to go to school abroad, to attend university in China, which, remember, hardly anybody did before the reform at the end of the 90s. So the Chinese are absorbing new experiences so fast, it's hard for them to keep up. And the economy has changed so much, become so diversified in such a short time, that the party is kind of scrambling to maintain control. The data on China, by which we try and perceive all these changes, is highly suspect. So even the data that I'm giving you, the demographic data seems to be pretty good, but as you'll hear, the economic and climate data is sketchy because China has a long tradition of publishing self-serving data and even of regional authorities submitting self-serving data to the central government to enhance the reputation of the local officials. Now, the Chinese do have enormous pride in their accomplishments and by and large respect the Communist Party for its role in the last 30 years of gains. But at the same time, again, the paradox, the Chinese are also very insecure. They see themselves as surrounded by a ring of Western-leaning or Western-affiliated states. They have great anxieties about the Communist Party, corruption, control, worry about Xi Jinping's personal rule, and they worry about rising inequality and whether change will continue upwards. We're going to hear about climate and environment. Let me just say one thing. One of the paradoxes in China is that a huge volume of the air and soil is deeply polluted from the rapid industrialization. Heavy metals like cadmium are widely found in the rice, grown in the soils. So is this a good or bad thing? From the perspective of the Chinese leadership, if people die 10 years earlier than they otherwise would because of widespread pollution, this could be a good thing in reducing the burden of elderly to support, but it could be highly dangerous if it becomes a political issue that mobilizes the population against the party. So again, I will simply say the future can be amazing or tragic, and will probably, in some respects, be both. Thank you very much.